In today's class, we'll be talking about HTML tags. To talk about this and to do some examples, to show some of the examples of HTML tags, we'll be making use of an IDE, very popular one called VS Code Editor. VS Code Editor is one of those best editor I love so much because of its simplicity and easy use or easy usage. There are other IDEs that you can also use, okay, like Sublime Text 3, you can use that. You can also use Bracket. So these are just few examples of IDs that you can use to get your work done when it comes to HTML designs or web designs. All right, so what are HTML tags? HTML tags consist of a very wide variety of tags, and these tags are what are used to create elements on the page. I remember in the last class I talked about HTML language, okay, being a markup language. Okay, so when we talk about this markup, so we are simply saying that a very good examples of what we are trying to say is that HTML are simply tags. Okay, they are simply tags, and these tags also can be defined. These tags also define everything that you talk about, from the heading part of it, from paragraphs to links to images, and then many more. Okay, so we'll be looking at some of the examples of HTML tags briefly. So let's look at some of the common ones when we talk about tags. Okay, what are some of these tags that we're talking about? So an example of an HTML tag is what we call H1. H1. Okay, H1. So this is a very good example. And then when you now have something like this, welcome to HTML class. So this is a very good example of an HTML tag. A tag consists of some other things within it. So this is an example, a very good example of an HTML tag. Right? Remember I said that HTML language, being a markup language, is called markup simply because it is always placed within a less and greater than symbols. So in other words, if I'm to remove this, for example, so if I have an H1, this H1 remains normal, remains the normal output, normal numbers that we all know. But the moment you are placing them, in a greater than and less than, the moment you have these symbols, okay, round any element, okay, then it becomes an HTML language. Okay, and this is what differentiates HTML language from every other languages. Okay, so example of common tags are we have H1 to H6. Okay, from H1 to H6. This is a very good example of an HTML tag. Okay, so what this the H1 missing means is the H1 or the H there. Okay, the H simply stands for heading. Okay, heading. The H there stands for heading. So this H1 to H6 simply means headings, right? Just imagine you're writing something. You want to write, or you want to design something on Microsoft Word. Okay, of course, you're going to give it an header. It will have a kind of heading. Okay, so that heading, there's a way you always style it. Okay, to differentiate it from every other words or paragraphs that you may have there. Okay, so we have from H1 to H6. So if we make this one H1, for example, look at what happens. So if we make this H1, so this is what happens. If we make this one H1, so we can see, okay, so as the number decreases, okay, then the font size or the bigness, the enlargement of the word that you're putting, the element that is inside, the content, we call this a content, okay, whatever is always in between elements, we call it content. So as you move from H1 to H2 to H3 to H4, H5, and H6, okay, the content gets smaller. So look at it. If we make this an H2, and then we'll say heading. So you see now that the text or the content is smaller. So the first one, we'll make this H3, then we'll call it heading. So as you increase the number, okay, then the content, the size of the content decreases. So let me go straight to H6. Then I call this, okay. So you can actually see now H6, and then we have H6. So it keeps on going, okay. So that's it. Another example of HTML tags. HTML tags is what we call the paragraph tag. Paragraph, paragraph tag. Okay. This is called paragraph. So this is called the paragraph tag. Another example that we'll be looking at is what we call the anchor tag. The anchor tag. The anchor tag. Another example of an HTML tag is what we call the image tag. An example, it's another example, the image tag. Okay, image tag, which is used to add image to your web page. So there are so many, several of them, so many of them, so many of them. So these are all examples. Anything that has a less than symbol and a greater than symbol enclosed around it, any word, any letter that have a less than or a less than and a greater than symbol round it, okay, becomes an HTML tag. So let's take note of this. Okay, quickly, another thing I want to talk about is as we look at all these tags, all the tags that we use on HTML designing our web page, there are two types of them. All right, there are two types of them. These tags also can be called elements, right? They can be called elements. Now take note of what I want to say now. A tag, okay, is simply this. Is simply this. Okay. This is an example of a tag. But the moment you start adding, the moment you add this to it, and then you put something in between it, okay, so the whole of this becomes an element. It becomes an element. So in other words, an element consists of an opening tag, the contents, okay, and then a closing tag, okay. So this is an example. This is when you now say we have our elements, okay. This is when we now say we have an element. Take note of this, okay. An element consists of things, and the content in between the tags, and then the closing content. So take note of this. There are two types or two categories of elements. And we have what we call the block element. The block elements, right? And then we have what we call the inline elements. Inline elements. So quickly let me explain what this means. When we say block elements are all examples of elements that once you place them on a steel row, they take complete control of the row. In other words, they just occupy the entire row. They do not allow any other element that you're bringing in to share the rows with them. So that's why we call them block elements. A very good example is this. Now, if you look at what we are doing here, look at all these typings we are doing. They are all appearing on the same row, okay, from the output page. Meanwhile, if you look at what we did here, we only add one, we only add this particular write-up on these rows. And these other ones, we add them on different rows. All right. So now what we are now saying is that when you are making use of elements, there's some set elements, once you put them into your page, okay, they sit once they enter into that role, they automatically take control of that role. They don't allow any other element or any other writer to share that role with them. Okay. So even though there may be spaces still available for other elements to occupy, but they certainly will not allow it. So an example of that is what we call it the div element. This is an example. Okay, let me put this. So this is an example, the div element. Then we have what we call the paragraph tab too. The paragraph element is also an example. Then we have the H1 element also. These are all examples. So the moment you put them on the space, they occupy space. All right. So let me show you an example of what I meant. So look at it now. If I have either an H1 or H3 element, if I have this H1 element, okay, and then I have grace of God. Now look at what happens. If I now want to write something else, maybe is available. So you can see now, you can actually see what has happened here. Okay, the grace of God. Now, instead of this to continue on this line, okay, it certainly moves to the next line, right? Why is it like that? This is because this element, which is called the header element, all right, has completely, the moment you put it in, okay, okay, I take over that role. I don't allow sharing, even though I may have space, other spaces, okay, that can still accommodate other elements, but I will not allow that. I don't mind. I don't mind, even if I'm going to waste, if I'm going to be wasteful, okay, of space. I don't care, but I don't want any other element to sit on the same row with me. Okay, so that's why we call them block elements. Okay, so the other one is called the inline element. So the inline element is just an opposite, all right, complete opposite of the block element. So the inline element are elements that does not take the entire full role when you insert them on your, okay, they are mindful of the space usage, okay, they are not wasteful like the block element. So an example of that, okay, is the span element, span element. So look at what happens here, okay. So you type in the grace of God, it appears here. Okay. After typing in the grace of God, from our HTML page, you see that it's available was typed on the next line. So one would have expected that this also will appear under the grace of God. But no, because it is an inline element that we're using, okay. So the moment you put it in, all right, it is not selfish. So what it does is it allows or create rooms for every other element that is coming in to share that same role with it. And that's why we call it inline element. I believe this is very, very good. There are so many other examples that we'll be looking at as we continue in our class.